Welcome. Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. When you hear the name William Wordsworth, what pops into your head? Probably a peaceful English poet, right? Just kind of wandering lonely as a cloud, gazing lovingly at some daffodils in the Lake District. Well, today we're going to look at a completely different side of the man. We are tracing the true, tumultuous, and honestly fascinating ideological evolution of one of the absolute founders of English Romanticism. We're talking about a guy whose intellectual journey took him from being a fiery, radical revolutionary, someone who actually defended the execution of a king, to a conservative, aristocratic government employee. Welcome to the real story of William Wordsworth.
So here is the ultimate question of his life. How does a passionate rebel who absolutely despises tyranny eventually transform into an aristocratic mouthpiece? A guy who literally writes letters expressing his fear of the, quote, ignorant population. I mean, that is a complete 180-degree turn in politics, philosophy, and poetry. To figure out how we get from point A to point B, we've got to look at exactly what he believed back in his 20s. Just take a listen to this incredible quote from 1793. In France, royalty is no more. And you know, he didn't write this with sadness or regret. He wrote it with indignant triumph. This is from his letter to the Bishop of Llandaff, and it is a piece of writing so radically democratic that he actually defended the French Revolution's darkest, most violent turns. He was a young man practically ablaze with the promise of equality. But you gotta wonder, where did this deep sympathy for the common people even begin? Let's jump into Section 1, The Boy of Nature, Roots in the Lake District. To find out where his worldview started, we really need to look at his earliest years. Wordsworth was born in 1770 in Cockermouth, Cumberland. And his childhood? It was kind of like a rural paradise. He spent his days just exploring the Derwent River. This is where his profound love for the beauteous forms of nature and his instinctive sympathy for ordinary people were permanently forged. But tragically, this childhood idol was totally shattered. His mother passed away in 1778, and then his father followed in 1783. He actually got lost on a freezing cold night during a business trip. This left the family totally fractured and under severe financial strain. Why? Because a wealthy local magnate named Lord Lothair owed his father's estate a massive debt, and he just flat out refused to pay it. William was separated from his beloved sister Dorothy, though. As we'll see, they would later form an intense, lifelong bond that literally saved his poetic career. Moving right along to Section 2, A Radical in France, Revolution and Romance.
Okay, let's move to and see how this builds. So we have a grieving, financially stressed young man with a deep connection to nature. His time at Cambridge was, well, pretty undistinguished, but what really woke him up was hitting the road. Look at his restless 20s. In 1790, instead of settling down, he goes on a massive walking tour of the Alps. And get this, he arrives in France exactly on the first anniversary of the storming of the Bastille. He is utterly intoxicated by the revolutionary fervor happening all around him. He goes back in 1791 and actually sits in on the National Assembly. Then, jumping ahead a bit, by 1795 he finally reunites and settles down with Dorothy at Racedown Lodge, and later moves to Alfoxden in 1797 to collaborate with fellow poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Fun fact, their habit of wandering the countryside at all hours was actually so suspicious to the locals that the government sent an agent to spy on them, thinking they were French spies. No way, right? But let's look a little closer at those crucial early years he spent in France.
During that time in France, Wordsworth became deeply, deeply immersed in Jacobinism. This was a radical political movement during the French Revolution that heavily championed democracy and equality. He attended the Jacobin Club, he got into these intense debates about radical politics with an intellectual army officer named Michel Beaupuy, and his passion for democracy just skyrocketed. He also fell madly in love with a Frenchwoman, Annette Vallon, who would later give birth to his child Caroline. He was living on the absolute edge of a brand new world order, totally driven by an almost utopian belief in human equality. And that brings us right back to 1793. Forced back to England because he basically ran out of money, Wordsworth reads a conservative sermon by the Bishop of Llandaff denouncing the French Revolution. Wordsworth is absolutely infuriated. He writes this indignant, unpublished reply, fiercely defending the radical thinker Thomas Paine, equality, and the revolution itself. And here's the real kicker. His democratic sympathies were so intense at this point that he told the bishop not to bewail the execution of King Louis XVI. He essentially argued that the king was just a human placed in a monstrous situation. This is the absolute peak of his radical phase, heavily influenced by the rationalist philosopher William Godwin. Which leads us to Section 3,
revolutionizing English poetry, the Great Decade. But as we know, something shifted. As the French Revolution descended into immense, terrifying violence, the Democrat in him gave way to the poet. He channeled all of that intense revolutionary energy into a totally new medium. This is the dawn of his great decade of work. Working closely with Coleridge, he writes the poems for lyrical ballads. And in the famous 1800 preface to this work, he outlines a completely new theory of human nature and art, declaring that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. He's basically tossing out all the artificial, highly decorated poetry of the past and inventing something deeply emotional and fiercely personal. He actually had a highly systematic three-part vision for this new kind of poetry. First up, use the real language of men instead of artificial diction. Second, focus on the lives of ordinary people, really keeping that early democratic sympathy alive in his art. And third, elevate the mind through a profound connection with nature. Why do this? Because Wordsworth sincerely believed that the increasing accumulation of men in cities and the frantic daily news cycle were reducing human minds to a state of almost savage torpor. He wanted his poetry to serve as a literal moral cure for the toxicity of urban society. And this brilliantly illustrates his shifting mindset. His masterpiece, Tintern Abbey, captures this pivot perfectly. He writes about how the memories of the beauteous forms of the Wye River Valley sustained him in lonely rooms and amid the absolute din of cities. He is directly pitting the healing moral power of nature against what he calls the dreary intercourse of daily life. So he has essentially replaced Godwin's cold political rationalism with an intuitive, feeling-based connection to the natural world.
All right, section 4, the conservative shift, from rebellion to reaction.
But here's where things get really interesting. The man who abandoned political revolution for poetic revolution was about to abandon his early social ideals altogether. Notice this massive intellectual pivot. In his youth, his foundation was William Godwin, all rationalism, republicanism, tearing down the old systems. But as he aged, he entirely swapped Godwin for the conservative philosopher Edmund Burke. Yes, the exact same Burke whose values he had once completely excoriated. Wordsworth began to argue that the only way to actually preserve the virtues of ordinary people was to maintain the traditional aristocratic social orders of English society. The definitive proof of this massive turn is his 1809 political tract, The Convention of Cintra, where his 1793 writings excitedly championed equality and the rights of man. This 1809 text shifted to strict, rigid concepts of patriotism and power. He was totally aligning with a conservative, nationalist view of European politics. One contemporary even remarks that his style closely resembled Edmund Burke's now. As our source material notes, by 1808, one could definitively say, in William Wordsworth, Jacobinism is no more.
Now, what's really interesting is the undeniable contrast in his own words. It's striking. On the one hand, we have the 23-year-old radical cheering the fall of kings. On the other, the 42-year-old conservative, writing in an 1812 letter to Catherine Clarkson about his intense alarm over public affairs. He doesn't blame oppressive institutions anymore, not at all. He blames the people. He complains that the lower orders have been accumulating in pestilential masses of ignorant population. Wow. It is a staggering retreat from the man who once so fiercely defended the rights of man.
Let's move into our final segment, Section 5, The Laureate's Legacy, Patronage and Tragedy. So what exactly cemented this transformation? It wasn't just abstract philosophy, It was deeply personal tragedy combined with a drastic change in his financial reality. In 1802, the heir of that wealthy magnate who ruined his father's finances, the new Lord Lonsdale, finally pays the family the massive debt they were owed. Wordsworth suddenly has actual financial prospects. But then, in 1812, unspeakable heartbreak strikes. His 4-year-old daughter Catherine dies in June, and just months later, his 6-year-old son Thomas tragically dies of measles. In a profoundly moving letter, Wordsworth describes how the sweet innocent yielded up his soul. Devastated, grieving, and needing security for his remaining family, in 1813 he accepts a salaried government position, distributor of stamps, which was secured for him by Lord Lonsdale. By 1818, he is actively publishing Tory electioneering tracts, backing the local nobility in absolutely no uncertain terms. The young rebel had fully become the establishment. By 1843, his standing was so firmly established within the traditional hierarchy of England that he was appointed the poet laureate of the country. And this was despite the fact that, by this time, his great decade of composing vibrant new verse was long, long behind him.
When he finally passed away in 1850, Victorian England venerated him as a safe, traditional sage. His most ardent admirers often just sort of conveniently glossed over his radical origins, his French lover, his defense of executing kings, his time under government surveillance. They swept the whole shebang under the rug. And that leaves us with that sanitized image of the tranquil nature poet we all know today.
Which leaves us with a profound question as we wrap up this explainer. Look at Wordsworth's life. The intense, fiery early fight for democratic equality, followed by a deliberate retreat into nature, poetry, and ultimately, conservative traditionalism. It really forces us to ask, does finding deep personal peace in the natural world require us to abandon the fight for radical, structural social change? It's the very tension that defined Wordsworth's life, and honestly, it's a tension that still heavily resonates today. Thank you so much for joining me in uncovering the real William Wordsworth. Keep questioning the narrative and keep exploring.